And now that we have to contend, as he said, we have to understand what good and evil is now. We have a higher consciousness with seeing the world. There is evil. There is a lack of God who is holy and good. And so when we have to confront this, there is a moral issue in our day-to-day lives. And if we were to be a nihilistic atheist, now, not all atheists will say they are nihilistic, but ultimately, if nothing changes in our lives, there's no progress. What is ultimate authority and idealism? What is that other than God? Again, pointing back to why I did this whole podcast thing, why I named it John Chen Out the World, is because people have a lot of questions about their orientation, about sexuality, about sex, about healthy sexuality, and the church does a terrible job sometimes of being vocal and apologetic about sexual practices and things. I'm like, why not talk about them with the most controversial people that I could think of, right? Christians, like right-wing people, and then these left-wing progressive LGBTQ people. Why not? I think there is such a precedence and need right now, especially in our polarized society, when legacy media is not serving its due diligence and doing justice to be able to tell the story as is. Hey guys, what's going on? I am John Chen, your host for John Chen Out's the World, and I wanted to be able to do a little special segment here today, just to be able to share a little bit about why I started the podcast channel and the YouTube channel. Now, this is going to be a little bit more personal, and if you haven't really been following my videos or my podcast, and even if you're not from my personal life, then you probably don't know a lot about me and my background story. So let's just dive into why I kind of got into podcasting in the first place. But before I begin, could you please subscribe and feel free to hit the notification bell so that you can keep updated about anything related to what I'm doing on the podcast and the channel as well. You know, I'm a Christian first and foremost. I also talk about sexuality, gender, LGBTQ issues, and that's just near and dear to my heart and my background story. But also, I don't prescribe to any one ideology. I'm a pretty open-minded folk. I like talking to people across different aisles and platforms and different views. So that's something that you'll be able to get a taste and see on the podcast. So feel free to check me out on Spotify as well as here on YouTube. And let me just start by saying thank you so much for all your support in the last season. With second season, I had my first guest, Mike Rosebush, and he is a dear friend of mine, someone who was a very conservative evangelical who later came to transition from a view of traditional marriage to affirming gay marriage and is currently married to another man. And so that's just a taste of what I discuss with many of my guests. Some of them have become Christians who basically disavowed of their views of homosexuality and try to live a celibate or a heterosexual union between man and woman. And there are others, sexual researchers, therapists like Joe Court, who discuss, men who question their sexuality, if they are straight or not. Many men who believe that they're straight or who have questioned their sexuality because of past trauma or just simply because of their bisexuality. So there are many different themes that I bring up in the first season that I really want to be able to carry over into the second season. And what better way, I think, to kind of set us up than talk about a little bit by myself, because all the guests, all the people that I look into to be able to bring onto podcasts, I really want to be able to research and talk about these themes around LGBTQ, faith, Christianity, the Bible, etc., and the scientific research on gender dysphoria, or whether it's sex abuse or maybe it's human sex trafficking. All these issues really do hit the crux of what the value of sex carries in our society across subcultures, whether it's LGBTQ, Christian, or otherwise. And for me personally, and today I really want to be able to discuss a little bit more about my personal journey throughout different ideologies. For me, I didn't grow up Christian, and it was really a wake-up call in many senses when I started to become Christian, because at the exact same time, I was also coming out of the closet, or I was outed. Right. I didn't have a chance to even describe who I was. And never did I actually ever have a chance other than maybe share behind closed doors with a few friends. And so ultimately, when I was growing up, I was very shy, somewhat precocious kid who really was into their feelings and art, and all the more effeminate traits were very much showing. So I remember when I was probably only 3 years old, I was trying to get a birthday cake. I lived in Michigan growing up, so I lived in Livonia, Michigan. If anybody's from Detroit area, shout out. But I grew up being a pretty effeminate kid, even from the get-go. So I would get my mom to buy me dolls and like nail polish and stuff for my birthday. And I don't remember this much, but all my other photos, I just see myself as a very normal boy growing up. But there are these moments where I can see there are some gender atypical things compared to my brother, my older brother. I just wasn't the same as some of the kids growing up. And for myself, I was very insecure, namely because I was Asian growing up in a predominantly white community. And then I also was different from the rest of the boys. I could tell that I just became a little bit more aware that I wasn't as into rough and tumble play. I wasn't into the same types of sports or sports in general, and just a bit squeamish and sensitive. So, given that background, I think a lot of people kind of share that, especially if you're a guy who has ever questioned their orientation. Sexuality was never something that really came up to mind, or those words, gay or faggot, were really kind of within the boyhood, the boy sphere, really words to attack one's manhood, not really even to benign, not even, it's benign, but like malignant in the sense that they were trying to just hurt your ego. And, kid, boys will be boys, as they say. So kids will be cruel and they would make fun of me. But I never felt as if I was gay. And I think a lot of people assume that you just knew from a very early age, but not a lot of people actually realize that there are plenty of boys and even girls who start to realize that they may not actually just be like singly attracted to one sex, right? But rather they could be attracted to both genders. And for me, I never had the terms growing up other than, being called the F word or gay, etc., as ways to demean my masculinity. I never realized that I actually was slowly becoming more attracted to boys, especially around middle school. Now, I just want to put in a caveat here that for those who don't know, I put John Chen out to the world because I want to tell the world, I want to not only let people know about myself and my orientation and all the questions I have about that, but really for those who are questioning about their orientation, it's okay. There's a lot of times when I felt like, oh my gosh, what happened if somebody found out? What if someone knows that I was attracted to a boy or another guy? And I just want to let you know, we live in 2023. It's okay. It's okay. But I know it seems like a lot because people are so scared about becoming something else, bisexual or homosexual. And really, those terms are things that people often like to label us with. And celebrities like Raven Simone and others who just don't want that label on them, even if they are attracted to people of the same sex. And so for myself, I don't even necessarily call myself gay. I don't even prefer the label bisexual because it just has a certain connotation about how I prioritize my life. And whatever those may be, promiscuous or just more flexible, I personally have come to the conclusion, especially as a Christian, that I should only date women and I will marry a woman if I choose to. So that's something that I never thought I would say. I really believe that I would be open to marrying a guy if I was attracted to a guy. And it wasn't until high school when I actually started reading the Bible. If it was my friends bringing me out to youth group and sharing with me about Jesus, or my stepmom who married into the family, and she was a very avid believer of Jesus, came from an atheist household. Most people in China still are because of communist trends. And, the communist government really pushed out religion from the get go when it usurped the old system. And so with my stepmom in our house, kind of the old system of, how our household was just, we don't talk about things. Not only did my parents not talk about faith, never did they explicitly ever say, this is Jesus and this is who he is, or this is God. And this is why marriage was designed this way, or this is how you do baptism. Nothing was taught to me about faith or religion, although there were moments growing up, maybe if we were lucky a couple times a month, that we brought out to church but no one ever talked to me or confronted me about, John, what do you believe about God? Like, do you have a personal relationship with Jesus? And these questions weren't brought up until high school. So, all growing up, me being the sensitive, shy, effeminate guy that I was, and my voice wasn't this deep at all. So, I've really grown and evolved as a human being, as a man too, in many ways. My parents separated when I was in fourth grade. My mom left the home around seventh grade. And at that time, I was really confused about who I was because my family didn't talk about things. They didn't explain their history, other than the fact that I knew that my parents were immigrants, they're Chinese. I would probably fill out Christian in an ACT or a census type of form if I need to put something in the hospital or whatever. But really, there was nothing I knew about the Christian faith, and no one ever taught me anything. So it wasn't until my sophomore year in high school that my stepmom introduced Jesus to me. She told me that he was God, that he came as a baby, and ultimately God required that humans make a sacrifice. In the old temple system in Judaism, it was the daily, weekly slaughter of animals for sins. But really, God did that so that he could show humanity that he had a better way. And what the old covenant was in Judaic law was that you had to sacrifice these animals for your sins to be cleansed. And that's the problem with talking about any type of religion, right? We want to be able to make our way to God through our works. But ultimately, she explained that it was Jesus. Jesus was the Lamb in the New Testament. A new covenant was given to us that everybody in the world may come to know who God is, his grace, his love, his kindness, his righteousness, right? All the law was fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And so as I saw that, I was like, you know what? Especially I was confused about a few things about the Bible. Like, do I believe in all the Bible? Is it hogwash? Is there some fiction in it? Is it just like some good stories, right? And once I'd gotten through that, I was thinking more and more critically about it, looking into Ravi Zacharias, looking at books later on in college, like I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. And, there are Francis Collins even, is a big name out there. You think about these scientists and people who worked in the NIH, in the government, who helped presidents, be able to work out the healthcare system. Astrophysicists like Hugh Ross, these are people that are very well educated, and I could just glean from, like, they are Christians, they are very devout evangelical Christians, but also they believe in science. They hold to a very acute and cogent way of thinking in the scientific practice and tradition. So when I could marry these ideas of, well, the world, the material world doesn't obviously have a morality. Like, you can't tell just looking at grass or looking at the sky that it could just spell out what you're supposed to do. If you should kill someone, if you should marry this person or marry that person, if you should drink or should not drink, like in Islam, you're told not to drink. And in Buddhism, you are not disallowed to drink, but it's really highly avoided. And so you have so many different moralities. And I was like, as a kid, how could they all be wrong? Like, I just didn't want to be that narrow minded. And so I still gave Christianity time. And that's the beauty of it. When I talk to these guests on the podcast, say Mike Rosebush, one of my dear friends, he was the first episode, like I just mentioned. And he became a born again believer when he was pretty young in his teenage years and then married his wife. But throughout that journey, as a vice president of Focus on the Family, he was coaching and leading many men and women, even talking about how marriage should be led. And, he was in the Air Force. And this guy was a very conservative Christian. But later on, after his wife's death and then his eventual deconstruction, he came to believe in a different form of Christianity, one that holds that gay marriage is okay. And so all these questions are really pivotal to what I discuss on the podcast, namely because when I was growing up in high school, I didn't have anyone explaining me why was gay marriage not okay? Why is it not okay? Right? Well, because the Bible says so. Well, the Bible says a lot of things, God killed a lot of people in the Old Testament. Okay. But John, you also understand, like, why is it not okay for God to kill people if it's okay for moms to abort their babies, right? Or for a country like the US to go into Afghanistan and kill people, right? Or for Palestinians to go and kill other people, Jews or etc., right? So there's a lot of social relevancy in terms of how we look at good and evil. And that's the first story of the Bible, which talks about our common ancestor, using evolutionary language here, of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve sinned against God because they disobeyed what he told them not to do, eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And now that we have to contend, as he said, we have to understand what good and evil is now. We have a higher consciousness with seeing the world. There is evil. There is a lack of God who is holy and good. And so when we have to confront this, there is a moral issue in our day to day lives. And if we were to be a nihilistic atheist, now, not all atheists will say they are nihilistic, but ultimately, if nothing changes in our lives, there's no progress. What is ultimate authority and idealism? What is that other than God, right? All these questions I continue to beg and think about and think through. As I went through college, I actually started going to Bible studies and went to church more. And it wasn't until I would say my freshman or sophomore year that I really started to come out to people like really more openly. And in junior year, senior year, I mean, I was pretty much out, to other people about these things. I didn't make it a big deal. I didn't call myself gay. I didn't call myself bisexual, but I said that I have same-sex attractions. That's kind of like the evangelical language. I don't love it, but it's the best that I got. And I like girls, I always liked girls growing up. But it wasn't until middle school and high school that I started to discover that I actually feel very attracted to guys as well. And the truth is, again, pointing back to why I did this whole podcast thing and why I named it John Chen Outs the World is because people have a lot of questions about their orientation, about sexuality, about sex, about healthy sexuality. And the church does a terrible job. I'm sorry, a terrible job sometimes of being vocal and apologetic about sexual practices. I know it's not one of the key tenets about becoming a Christian, and becoming a Christian is the most important, but I would say for myself and for many people, especially Gen Z, I mean, a fifth of the population of Gen Z believes that they are LGBTQ. What does that mean, right? When we think about the rhetoric of the gay liberation movement, and in the late 19th century, there was this term coming out. It was borrowed from the Southern debutantes, and it was used in such a way that the homosexuals were basically outing themselves out to friends, very close friends, usually homosexual or close cohorts and such. And you have these homophiles and early movements that were trying to be more open about sexuality, especially when it went into Harvey Milk in the 70s and then with the 80s AIDS epidemic. And it just became such a big issue that they needed something to unite around when their basic PR problem was, you're gay, you're diseased, right? You're gay, you have AIDS. They needed something bigger, and it was love. And I would argue throughout this process, I can see looking at the history of LGBTQ, Stonewall in 1969 and becoming this big LGBTQ movement, there was so much precedence for it because of civil rights and this idea that all people are equal. And I really wanted to be able to inject this idea that whoever came onto this podcast, whoever I have conversations with, they are my equal on some level, even if we disagree about, say, gender dysphoria and how to treat it, or about minor attracted persons. I'm personally against advocating for minor attracted persons. I think that's something that should be a taboo. You can change my mind. I'm open to it. Should there be research done on minor attracted persons? Potentially, right? Sex abusers are not the same as minor attracted persons. That's something I learned from Dr. Malcolm, Jeremy Malcolm. And, I have these very controversial personalities on because there's truth in the fringes as well as the center. When we talk about middle ground issues, whether it's abortion or gay rights and gay marriage, and whatever it may be, there's a lot of religious undertones because in this country, in which I proudly grew up in, I didn't realize the freedoms of free speech, freedom of religion that I got to hold because my parents and so many of our founding fathers and veterans and so forth fought for those rights for us. And now that we have the independence to think freely and talk about these things, I'm like, why not talk about them with the most controversial people that I could think of, right? Christians, like right wing people, and then these left wing progressive LGBTQ people. Why not? I think there is such a precedence and need right now, especially in our polarized society, when legacy media is not serving its due diligence and doing justice to be able to tell the story as is. whether it's Fox or CNN, there's a lot of backbiting. There's a lot of just a lot of polarization and accumulation of knowledge that's only bent towards one way and towards one demographic of people. But now we have to find forms in which we start to listen again. We have to begin to understand and show empathy towards other people. And for myself, I wouldn't have survived growing up as a guy, questioning my own orientation and then having other people around me, say my abuser. I was sexually exploited, groomed growing up by a instructor, and this employer instructor basically used a bunch of the boys from our tennis team. And so when I was silent about that, I really believe that it was just a no big deal. But a lot of people have these instances of abuse. A lot of people have these instances of questioning who they are, and they don't get to talk about it because there's such a stigma and polarization of issues. They're afraid of the consequences. Here, I want this podcast to be a platform where everybody gets to have a say. Leave a comment in the comment section. Give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down. It doesn't really matter to me. I want to show people that it's worth talking about these issues because it affects families, it affects romantic relationships, it affects our self-esteem and our mental health. All these things about masculinity, about gender dysphoria, about the role of women, say, in households or in church, whatever it may be, theological points about marriage, all these things have to relate back to our purpose of what is the greater good, right, for society. And we have to do our own part. And so for me, I'm doing my part. I believe that John Chen Outs the World is not simply out to get people. I'm not here to like out people because, I hated being outed by one of my best friends growing up. Within that time, she brought me out to youth group. She also suffered from addiction. And although she grew up in a very loving Christian household, she was adopted and she never felt like she could really receive that love from her parents. And so she went to the worst places to find that love and essentially was addicted to methamphetamines, prescription drugs, and so forth, heroin at one point. And I saw that ridiculous amount of betrayal, evil, hurt, and hatred in her life within all of her relationships. And she slowly burned off bridge after bridge. And so when it came to me, I realized that, there was nothing there other than to tell her the truth. You need help. And for me, I didn't know at that point I needed that help as well because she later on told people, and in the midst of our relationship, sophomore, junior, and senior year, she was already telling people behind my back about my questions, about my orientation. And I needed the help of being reassured, of being told, John, you have a purpose for your life. And that's what happened when I met God. That's what happened when I gave my life to Christ, is that God told me that you're meant to love me and I'm meant to love you. And God wants us to be able to love one another. It means laying our lives down, being merciful towards even our enemies, praying for our enemies, listening to other people, right? I mean, Jesus talked to Samaritans, one of the most hated groups amongst Jews. And so he showed us what it meant to really love well. And I don't think I have come across a character in human history as more loving, compassionate, and as self-sacrificing as Jesus. Only God can do something like that. Only God. And so the miracle done in my life really is one to evoke a sense of curiosity about what the truth is. And God wants me to be able to delve into higher knowledge about, any type of theme around sexuality, gender, marriage, family, and social policies around maybe sex trafficking or pornography. All these things deal with the inner, the individual, but also relate to and have consequences for society and the other. And how we disagree, and hopefully we can disagree in a very even-handed and civil manner. I want to be able to talk about these so that everybody who's watching even now can get a taste of who I am as I'm talking to these people. Like, what is my agenda? My agenda is really to uncover what the truth is, what the truth of our nature is, if there is such a thing as a true human nature and personality, and how that changes perhaps between context, what that looks like between context. I truly believe that humans are humans. And at the end of the day, we have basic needs for love, acceptance, belonging, and ultimately that in my faith tradition, in my understanding, that traumatic love of Jesus sets people free. And ultimately, you will You'll be bound by that love, though it's freedom. That truth that sets you free is bounds you to that truth. And that's the only thing that you can really live by, because there's a lot of lies with the media. There's a lot of gossip. There's a lot of slander. There's a lot of, trivial, transient trends and um, studies, even, that come and go. Research and science is like that. There's revolutions. But what is ultimately true about human nature is something that is also very pivotal to what these discussions are about. We care about people. In this podcast, I want people to humanize, to see people as they are, not as we preconceive them, as we presuppose them to be, because we have a lot of stereotypes and biases about who LGBTQ folks are, who conservative Christians are, and who Black individuals are, who Jews are, who Asians are, and a lot of the times those don't fit neatly with us as individuals. So the more that we hear, the more that we can speak more cogently and clearly about how the individual is maximized within the social environment. And for me, I wanted to be able to do this on a personal level, not only to share my story and help other people understand, what the journey could look like for somebody who's in the closet and coming out, but also somebody like myself who was outed without my own consensus and trying to navigate what it meant to become a Christian who wanted to pursue marriage and become married to a woman, but also struggling with my identity or attractions. And so when you are questioning these things of abuse or attraction and orientation, I want you to be a part of it so that you can glean some matter of guidance, some matter of well documented research, and hopefully you'll be able to come away feeling refreshed, energized, inspired, even to be able to do your part and continue the story. These podcasts are a bit long form because, I could do 30-minute talks or 10-minute talks. And in the future, I'll do more of these personal one-on-one talks with you, my audience, because I really want to get to know you and hopefully you get to know me and my thoughts as well. But ultimately, I want you guys to be able to take away a part of each of these stories from the podcast interviews and even from my own story. So this isn't me being interviewed or me interviewing myself. I don't have a list of questions, but I was just kind of free flowing, giving you my thoughts on why did I find myself here, right? As the host of John Chen Out's the World, of trying to better our acceptance of one another when there are big, big disagreements and differences across the aisles, across different communities. I want us to be able to find more acceptance around the difficulties, because the difficulties will be met by each one of us in the workplace, in our places of worship, in schools, and in our personal lives, one way or another, in our own selves, most importantly. And I believe that if we believe in God, or we believe in truth, or we believe in a higher purpose for our lives, we have to be able to put our mouth where our money is. We have to be able to sacrifice and speak our minds. We have to be able to put ourselves out there and take that risk so that other people can judge us, so that we can judge ourselves and have very rich, meaningful discussions that hopefully give us something to work off of and building our own narratives for the hopeful future. So thank you so much for joining me on this episode of John Chen Out's the World. I've never done a talk like this, but I really enjoyed being able to discuss a little bit about what I've been thinking through, as I move forward with the podcast, and how I've been discussing very poignant and interesting themes, topics around sexuality, gender, faith, Christianity with you all and with these guests. And I really hope that you'd be able to take even more. Let me know what you guys think. If there is any ideas or any collaborative interests that you guys have, I really want you guys to be a part of the community and add into it. So please let me know what you think and put something down in the comment section below. Don't forget to subscribe and send a notification bell click so that you can keep me in contact. All right, I'll see you guys on the other side. See you next time.